Welcome to Thursdays with Troy, everyone. As always, I'm Troy Lambert, mystery author, editor, and super plotterer, and your host. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Claire Taylor. Claire Taylor is a fiction strategist, the owner of FFS Media, where she helps writers supercharge their stories. She's also an indie author with 30 plus published novels and professionally edited 200 plus fiction manuscripts with experience in every stage of the editing process, from outline evaluation to proofreading. Her passion lies in telling a story that sticks with readers long after they finish the last page, and she loves helping other authors achieve that goal. And that's what we're going to talk about today, at least in part. So welcome, Claire.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And it is wonderful to have you. Our topic today is like Myers-Briggs and socionics and the four temperaments. The Enneagram, and I'm going to slaughter that, is one of many systems within the study of personality theory. And this is always fascinating for writers to do with their characters. These systems are designed to identify the patterns found in different ways we approach various aspects of life, so we might better study and understand ourselves and others, and in the case of writers, our characters. In short, this is not only a useful life tool, it's also a perfect character creation tool. So to get started, tell us more about what sets this personality system apart from the others that I just mentioned.
So what I really love about the Enneagram is that it is defined by core motivations. So that breaks down into core fears and core desires. So what is really driving you at that very basic level, which is, of course, what we want to know about our characters when we get to writing, because if you don't know that, what you tend to do is actually project your own core motivations onto your characters. So you'll write them so they're a little bit different from you. And so other core motivations, subconsciously, that there's something else. But when they get into a crisis situation, a lot of the times you will then revert back to, well, what would I do? And that isn't always the case, right? So the Enneagram is a 9-type personality, profiling tool. So once you know what type your characters are, and you don't have to type every character that just, comes in and delivers the food and leaves, right? But once you know what your protagonist and your antagonist are, it just makes everything a little bit easier, and you don't risk, that sort of dreaded reader review of that character would never do that. So you can avoid that and make sure that it stays really consistent on that deep, almost intuitive level that the readers can pick up on.
So tell us how important this core motivation is to character development, because I like how you're centering that around motivation. Mm-hmm. So tell us how vital that is to your character development.
Well, for example, if you're writing a character that has a different motivation from you. So if you're writing, say, a type 7, which is the enthusiast, they are going to be, their whole fear is going to be about being trapped in pain. And so what you want to do to create an interesting story is try and trap them in pain as much as possible.
Right.
Right. Because then they're really going to be squirming. Whereas they're not going to be as afraid of, let's say, if you're a type 5, it's about competency and making sure that you feel competent all the time. Your fear is to basically need someone else to bail you out. You want to be very competent and self-contained. And so that would be a different story, right? So, if you put a 7 in a position where they aren't entirely competent, it's not as big of a deal for them. They will crack a joke and, find a way out, or they will, call on a friend to come help them because that's not a problem for them. So yeah, once you know that, and once you know what is really going to, what they're going to move toward their desire and what they're going to move away from, you're kind of the puppet master of that character, right? So when you're like, I need to get them from point A to point B, and I don't know how to do that, right? Because maybe you've plotted, you have these great scenes, you need to connect them. You just physically need to move one from here to here, but you don't want to do it in an unrealistic way. Well, you are, kind of playing God in your fictional universe, so you can just throw something in that will trigger them in that specific way and totally believably get them to where you need to be.
That is awesome, because it segues actually beautifully into my next question, which is, how important is this type of character development, like deep character development, to someone who's writing a plot-driven story?
It's very important because, sometimes you'll hear someone describe a book or a movie as tropey, right? It has too
Mhm.
many tropes. Well, there's really not such a thing as too many tropes. What happens is that you have a bunch of tropes that are not, connected, not battened down to anything substantial on those deeper levels. So once if you're writing a very plot-driven book or series, that's great. You just now know with the motivations why they're going from one to the other. It doesn't have to be this deep. We don't have to go into deep, psychological moments with them. We don't have to see inside their head a lot, because there's sort of an intuitive part of the Enneagram where we know someone of each type. And it's, even though we haven't defined it and really written it out, like, oh, that's this type of person, they're motivated by this. We understand when a character is not acting right.
Right.
So you, the author, should know all this stuff. You don't have to, info dump it all on the
Explain the reader. This is a 7-2.
Right. Right. Yeah. You don't have to just do constant flashbacks to that time that fear, they developed this deep fear when they were 3 years old or whatever. But people will know, right? And it just makes it a lot richer. So it can really tie that plot together and help you figure out when each of these awesome scenes that you want to do, like where they should go, based on the emotional ups and downs through the Enneagram levels of development.
Awesome. That is actually really, because I think we see this a lot with plot-driven writers. They put some tropes in there and they just have the story. And sometimes that doesn't make necessarily a great book. It can make a good book, but not a great one. Well, I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to ask you a few questions specifically about, you have set this up in Plottr with these 9 different types and the different levels. So first of all, I'm just going to ask you, where do you start? When you start developing a character using this, where do you start in Plottr? Because I mean, I look at this, I'm like, oh, this is really big. This is really in-depth. This is really cool. But where do you start? How do you determine where your character falls on this scale?
Right. So I will usually start this is just more of a chart. It's not that you don't have to use all of these. And I would actually encourage you not to use all of these. That's too much. We can start different places. So if you have kind of a basic nugget of a story, kind of the spark, and you can figure out, well, what is this story really about? What is the conflict that I liked that drew me to this? Then you can pick an Enneagram type that will resonate with that particular conflict. And you want to learn a little bit about the basic core fears and desires of each type before you can do that. But there are charts. Don't worry, there are charts. So then once you know your character's type, you can begin to see these different levels. So you have levels 1 through 9, you can see on the screen here. And level 1 is the healthiest level for that type. And level 9 is, destructiveness. It's very bad. Levels 1 through 3 are called the healthy levels. So if you are exhibiting those sorts of behaviors, you are, in a healthy version of your Enneagram type. 4 through 6 are average. That's where most people spend their time. And then 7 through 9 are unhealthy. So when you're developing your character, you really don't want your protagonist to spend almost any time in 7 through 9. You can put your antagonist there, but I tend to prefer having antagonists that are in average levels, because it makes it much more interesting when your antagonist isn't just this bad villainous guy who's sitting on his chair stroking his evil cat. So you can put your protagonist and your antagonist, they can be fighting each other, and both spend a lot of time in those healthy levels, but of different types, and it's going to create really interesting friction, because what we're looking at is people who have different core motivations, and that tends to lead to different values and beliefs on a similar topic, aka the theme. So that's kind of how I use it. So this is just a chart. We have the different levels, and throughout your story, your characters will go through different levels. This is not a static thing. So they may start at maybe a level 5 or 6 if they're really kind of not keeping their life together. And throughout the course of the story, they're going to kind of move up and down. So there will be moments where they're at their best and they're going to look, maybe they're more like a level 2 sense of self. So that is sort of embodying these ideas that they value. So for a type 1, the reformer, their level 2 looks like conscientiousness. I am reasonable. So that is them being very reasonable and not, not judgmental, but just sort of present in the moment. That would be a level 2. And that is going to be like a scenario, where they're really stepping up and kind of taking responsibility or doing the right thing. You won't see your antagonists, assuming we're talking about, actual like villain antagonists, not like love interest antagonist kind of thing. You're not going to see them in the super high levels a lot. They'll pretty much hang out in the average or low. So that's kind of how I use that. And you can chart it and pick which character you're going to use and look at their progression. And then you can use that for plotting.
So this obviously creates some interesting character interactions. So can you give us some like an example of 2 different levels that would just conflict with each other, kind of, even if they're both in that average level? What kind of a conflict could you create in that?
Well, the great thing about the Enneagram is that every single pairing you have between types is going to have sort of a unique flavor of conflict. Because, if you think about it, you may get along with a friend for like 90% of the time, but there's going to be topics where you and your friend are like, either we shouldn't talk about this or we can't be friends anymore, right? And that's going to be sort of this where our values diverge. So if you have, say, an achiever, which is type 3, and their core motivations are about self-worth and basically like what amounts to their self-worth, where do they get it? And it's usually through achievement. So that's what they're worried about. They're very productive types generally because they think their worth comes from their accomplishments, right? So if you think that, you're like, well, I better get my butt and get some stuff done. And then you have the reformer, let's say a type 1. Reformers also get a lot done. But it's more out of a sense of obligation because their core fear is being corrupt or bad, and they want to be above reproach, morally above reproach. And so a lot of the times, especially, in sort of Western culture, to be above reproach, you want to be very productive. So the 1s and 3s will be very productive and they'll look a lot alike. So if you have a story where maybe your protagonist is a type 1, the reformer, and your antagonist is a type 3, the achiever, they could start out as very good friends, or they could be working on a project together, some sort of shared goal. And the conflict is going to come in when you have a decision between what is most advantageous to them and what is the right thing to do. When those 2 aren't the same thing, you're going to have the 1 and the 3 split. The 3 is going to say, the achiever is going to say, we have to do the most advantageous thing to achieving our goals. And the 1 is going to say, the reformer is going to say, we have to do the right thing. Even though it's not going to get us to our goals, we have to do that. So that's where that conflict is going to come in between those 2. And you can pretty much match any pair and find where they're going to get along and work well together and where they're really going to start butting heads because of their core fears and core desires.
So essentially that core motivation, that core thing is what is essentially where the conflict comes from, regardless of how you're putting these together.
Yes. And there's also the aspect going to the development levels, which is right. It's more defined and more like granular. People tend to get along with people of the similar health level. So if you're a healthy, whatever number, you're going to get along with other healthy whatever numbers because you've kind of, moved ahead and you can be able to see things from other people's point of view. It's basically a diminished ego need the higher up you get. Average levels will get along. They're going to have a little more conflict. Obviously, the unhealthy levels probably won't get along with anyone. But the problem is when you start to have, maybe you're writing a romance and you have one character who is, let's say, a type 5, the investigator, very much into competency, and they are healthy. They spend a lot of their time up in level 2, right? So they're confident, they know what they're doing, and then you have their partner in the romance is a type 2, the helper, but they spend most of their time down in level 5. That's going to be a problem because of the difference of development levels that can really, an Enneagram is used for a lot of, counseling and that sort of thing as well. And so with marriage counseling, that becomes the big problem. It's not that any specific types, if you just grab 2, they can't get along. The real problem is when they are at very different development levels. So you can do that with your romance as well.
Oh, excellent. Okay, that is, and so would you say that any of these types fit for a particular genre more than another, say?
Not generally. Because you have these types, you're just going to have different themes. And basically, any theme can be present in any genre, right? You may think like, okay, a theme of like, friendship or family. That seems like it would be more in something like, maybe like women's fiction or YA or something like that. But then you see a show like Supernatural where it's all action and stuff. And that's the theme, right? It's family first kind of thing. SPM family, they've built this whole brand around it. So you can kind of go with any theme. There are going to be some that are going to lend themselves or that you see more frequently. So type 8, the challenger, you see that a lot in, anything that needs a captain to lead people into battle. So the challenger is all about, they're afraid of being trapped in harmed by others or controlled by others. And their desire is basically to be autonomous and be in control of themselves and avoid that fear. So you have Katniss Everdeen is an 8, right? Very much, we're going to go and we're going to fight. You see a lot of those kind of bold figures in anything like dystopian, military sci-fi or something like that, where you have those kind of bold leadership characters who maybe are a little too rough and struggle with vulnerability. So that's a big challenge of the challenger. So but you can really pick any type. And I like to suggest to authors when they first start using this to figure out what their type is and have that be their protagonist, because that's going to be the easiest way to avoid sort of that cross-contamination.
Yeah, when you're starting out new, write what you know type of thing.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. And you're going to enjoy it and you're going to connect with it because there's someone who has the same motivations as you that you're putting into all these situations that would kind of trigger you. And so you can work through them. So it can be a really fun experience when you start off to use the same type.
That is excellent advice. Well, so we've got this cool chart here that you've created, which I actually really love. I want to dig into this a lot deeper. So what other resources would you recommend to someone who's just starting out with using this method and they want to really take a deep dive?
Okay, so a deep dive, there are plenty of books on the Enneagram, but there aren't any that are relating it to fiction. But I feel like most authors, if you understand something about the human condition, you can then apply it to your fiction. So one that is a good starter is called The Road Back to You. And it's a book by Ian Morgan Cron and Suzanne Stabile, I think it's called, or it's pronounced. Just like a heads up, the Enneagram kind of dives into spirituality and religion a little bit. You can secularize it as much as you want and it still applies. So The Road Back to You is a little bit, I don't know if we can, yeah. So that's the cover, yeah. That's a really good starter. It is a little bit more on the spiritual side. And then there's also, Rizzo and Hudson are pretty much the originators of the model. So I have this book, Understanding the Enneagram. I think it's out of print, and they have a new version called The Wisdom of the Enneagram. And this is written like a textbook. Like it's chunky, right? It's very dense. So if you really want to go hard on that, that's a good one for it.
Those ones are really awesome because I like to dig deep. I'm more of a researcher type thing. But if someone just wanted a blog, like a regular blog, something like that, are there things out there?
Well, I have a YouTube channel that I talk about this kind of stuff. Not to plug my own, but
no, please plug your own. Please plug your own.
Yeah, so I do videos on Enneagram, and I apply it a lot of times to sort of the author career as well, how to make sure that your author career is fulfilling you based on your Enneagram type. So all of that is, it's just a redirect link. If you go to ffs.media/YT, that'll take you to my YouTube channel where I have all those author videos, and most of it's about Enneagram.
So what other resources have gotten you where you are now? Like what writing resources, what other resources have gotten you to where you are today?
A lot of it is just engrossing myself in it. So I worked, I have my degree in English with creative writing. And then I taught English for a while. So teaching has actually taught me a lot, right? Because you think you know 8th grade English until you have to teach it and then you have to relearn it again. And so that helped a lot. I did a lot of editing. Out of out of college. I worked in-house at a romance publishing company, and just reading a lot. I really think that is the key. I do hear a lot of authors who say they don't really read fiction, but that's pretty much it. I mean, I do occasionally read a plot book here and there, but for me, what I like about the Enneagram is that it's not so rigid. It's once you understand the flow of this sort of human desire, as long as you know a few basic things, right? Like it shouldn't just be stagnant, right? There should be conflict. There should be a good point followed by a uh-oh, followed by another victory, like kind of the flow of keeping people interested and the tension of it. That's how I like to base my plotting, on sort of these deeper levels of fear and desire.
So you obviously, it seems like you're more of a character-driven writer. So do you base your plot kind of on the character arc more than you do necessarily the story arc?
Yeah. I mean, the characters really drive it. I write satire, so I have to kind of balance that, because in satire, it's like, okay, what do I want to make fun of? And also, what characters do I want to be the ones to make fun of it? Like who needs to be, the sort of straight man in this comedy, and who needs to be the comic relief, although there's a lot of comic relief because it's comedy. So I kind of, I can find these sort of secondary characters that hit these different Enneagram types and just throw them in when I need. So I try and keep it kind of diverse. So like this story that I plotted out for today, and it's one that I've been working on, a series I've been working on. It's a comedy, a space comedy. And I knew that I kind of wanted it to be about vulnerability. And I thought a type 7, the enthusiast, would be great for that because they're afraid of pain. And so they do kind of run away from deep stuff because it could cause them pain. So it's character driven, but it's also based on the themes that I wanted to explore.
Right, exactly. So we're kind of looking at your main character here. And so we can see that she's a 7 with 8 Earthling.
Yes, she's an Earthling, and she's a 7 with an 8 wing. So in the Enneagram, you have your main type, which for her is a 7. And then you have, usually one wing is more pronounced. So a wing is the number to each type. So the Enneagram is set up like a big circle. And so for a 7, she could either have a 6 wing or an 8 wing. And those are going to look a little bit different. And you can also get more complicated where certain situations one wing comes out and certain situations another one comes out. But usually you have a predominant one. So that 8 wing is the challenger. So she's very, she's fine to sort of run away from everything. She's a little bit avoidant of all the responsibilities of life. But when she's challenged, or when, someone really calls on her to step up, she comes in real strong, right? So she's, if certain things that she cares about are in danger, she'll come in swinging. So that's basically what the 7 wing 8 is. So I started with her, and then I wanted to pick a bunch of characters whose types would really clash with her in the right kind of ways. So we have that, we have Dan's own. He's a 6 with a 5 wing. So the 6 is the loyalist, and they are all about security and feeling supported. And so he's a little bit phobic of everything. But he has this 5 wing where he has just a huge amount of knowledge in a couple subjects. And one of those is weapons and one is culture. So his thing, he's the minister of weapons and culture. They just sort of pair those things together in space because, if culture and diplomacy fails, what do you turn to? So
yes, I love that quote. That quote is fantastic.
So I thought he would be a good match for her because as a 7, she doesn't really think that far ahead. And she's not really concerned. I mean, she thinks ahead, but more of like, where can I seek out pleasure? Whereas he thinks ahead of like, where are we going to get in trouble? And so he kind of balances her out in that way. And so I thought, well, we need someone who's going to do that and is going to kind of be a wet blanket for her that she has to deal with. And then sometimes when push comes to shove, his type 6 can go counterphobic. And that's when the weapons come out, right? So he's kind of a fun character that can go back and forth. And then Susie Machiavelli, Mach, is the second in command. And she is a 3-wing 4 because I wanted, like, the 3s can get very competitive, right? They're the achievers, and they want to, they measure their worth, generally until they kind of reach higher levels, in how people see them. And a lot of that is accomplishments. And so the fact that she's playing, she's second fiddle to this sort of flitty captain character who is grossly underqualified for any of this, is going to be another point of tension because she is such a high achiever and probably deserves the role more. And so that competitive nature is a source of a lot of fun and conflict.
All right. Well, that is an excellent example. That brings us back to, actually, where can people learn more about you, and where can they follow you and stalk you and all those various different things? Obviously, your website. Tell me other places.
You can also go follow me on Instagram. ffs.media is the handle for that. I have my business Instagram. I have my personal one, which you can follow me there too, but I'm not really doing much with that. I'm kind of doing a social media fast. But the professional one is there, and I post little tidbits. YouTube, you can follow me on YouTube. I post videos every Friday on YouTube with new stuff, and we kind of jump around on all the topics people are interested in. One that people have really liked is Enneagram talk styles. So each type, the way they express their thoughts is through different. So just a little preview, like type 1s are sermonizing. Everything they say, even if they don't really care about it that much, it sounds a little bit like a sermon. 2s tend to be advising. They sound like they're always giving advice, that sort of thing. So it's stuff like that that's just fun little tips. You can usually take something from my videos and put it in your writing right away. I want it to kind of be like easy things to keep things fun and exciting, spice up that relationship a little bit between you and your books. I also, if you just go to my website, I have a free course. That's a free 5-day course for anyone who's interested. And that is the Indie Author Alignment. So we use the Enneagram to talk about different types of our career, different layers of our career, including how your books fit with your personality and how you can create this sort of seamless persona, and explore themes that really matter to you and keep you interested. So that is on my website. I do have some courses, but if people want to buy them, they can buy them. I don't know. It's whatever. I have plenty of free stuff to last people.
Excellent. Well, we every Thursdays with Troy, as you know, probably if you've seen these before, we have a question of the day. But this time I'm going to ask you one that's usually we're a little more on the humorous side, but on this one, I want to ask you something that relates to our topic pretty directly. And that was, if you could sit down with any writer, living or dead, and walk through their Enneagram with them, who would that be?
Walk through it, like to help them figure it out?
Yeah, to help them figure out where they fit. And then you would know where they fit, obviously. And so would the rest of us. So pick something we're all interested in, of course.
Yeah, I mean, no pressure.
No pressure.
I would pick Kurt Vonnegut, but mostly because I would want to just talk with him.
Yes. Oh,
and I haven't been able to nail, because it's almost impossible to guess someone else's Enneagram type because you're assuming motivation that you don't necessarily know of another person. But sometimes people make it very obvious once you get to know it. But for Kurt Vonnegut, I have not been able to figure it out. I know I just love him. And so part of me is like, well, maybe he's my same type so that I'm just vibing with him. But I would love to.
Maybe that's possible. That's one I would love to figure out too. That is a fantastic answer. And he has Kurt Vonnegut's Shape of Stories still to me is one of the most brilliant, simplest explanations of the shape of stories ever.
I don't know if you can see that on my bookshelf right behind me. That's all Vonnegut right there. So I keep it close. I
love it. Anyway, he's just one of my top favorites of all time. It's just fantastic. Anyway, well, with that, thanks you everyone for joining us on Thursdays with Troy. We hope that you enjoyed yourself and hopefully you learned a lot and it gave you some pointing towards some resources to learn even more. And with that, we'll see you next Thursday for another Thursdays with Troy. Bye, everyone.